Please open your Bibles to 2 Samuel 2. 2 Samuel 2. 2 Samuel chapter 2. That is not Hebrews. The fellow who was supposed to teach got sick. Russ is the original, and he's out of town in a gospel meeting. And so I was asked to teach, and I said, okay, we're doing 2 Samuel, because that's what I was prepared to teach this morning. You folks that are in my 2 Samuel class, we're going to deviate from the way we've been doing it, and I'm going to really just teach this lesson. And so there won't be a lot of that give and take we've been doing in the back. It's just a little tougher to do in the auditorium, and I don't like doing it in the auditorium. So I'm going to teach the material. And if you have questions, especially you folks that have not been in the Samuel class, if you have questions about something, feel free to raise your hands, and I will be glad to defer it to next week when I won't be in here. So I'm just kidding. But if you have questions about something, just feel free to ask. I'll do my best to answer the particular question. 2 Samuel 2, this is where we'll be in our study this morning. And before we jump into any of it, let's go to God in prayer. Father, we thank you for the blessings that you give us. We're thankful for this time of study this week. We're thankful for this congregation that meets here. We'd ask that you'd be with our shepherds, watch over them. We'd ask that you'd be with our deacons and their service to this congregation. Father, please be with each and every member of this group, that we can all strive to be better servants of yours in the kingdom. We can exonerate you as the true and living God. We can exalt your holy name in this world. Please give us opportunities to share the gospel. Give us courage and wisdom to do it. Father, be with us in our study this morning, that we can look at the books of Samuel. We can look at the life of King David. We can glean from it things that will help us better serve the true King, Jesus Christ. Help us, Father, to be faithful to the text and faithful to you. We love you and we praise you, and we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. 2 Samuel 2. Let me give you a little bit of the background here. David has been on the run for a number of years, and this is actually going to overlap a little bit with my sermon this morning, so there'll be a little bit of convenience here. David has been on the run for years, and there's some difference as to how long he's been on the run, but we're looking at between 7 and 10 years of David's life he spent running from Saul. We get to the end of 1 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Samuel are one book in the Hebrew Bible. We divide them because of scroll length in our Bibles, but we get to the end of 1 Samuel. David is way far south in Israel. He is a long ways from Mount Gilboa. He is a long ways from the Sauline conflict where Saul will eventually die, and Jonathan along with him. So at the end of 1 Samuel, we've got the account of Saul's death given very briefly. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 1, David receives news of Saul's demise and Jonathan's demise. And a young man brings him the crown, which would have been the pseudo-crown that he would have worn in battle, not the big royal crown. But they bring him the crown, and they bring him the armband to signify the king. Well, you don't get that unless the king is dead on the battlefield. So he brings it to David. David has that young man executed. And then David sings a song that will be taught to all of Israel, exonerating Saul and Jonathan as mighty men of war. Beautiful song. We spent some time covering it in class on Wednesday night. It really is a powerful message, and there's a lot of lessons we could take from it. When you start 2 Samuel 2, David is now going to become the recognized king, but there is some difficulties with that because there is still some lineage from Saul who would have a claim to the throne. Now, up to this point, we think about this because we're shaped by medieval thought. We think about the line of the kings, and that does happen in Judah after David's death. Who gets David's throne when he dies? One of David's sons, Solomon. Who gets Solomon's throne when Solomon dies? One of his sons, Rehoboam. And that line continues through the Davidic lineage. But before David passes it to Solomon some years later, that's really not an established principle yet. So they're following, at least Ishbosheth is following some generally recognized Canaanite practices. Saul was king. Who gets to be king after Saul? His son. Except at this point, the king in Israel is appointed by God alone. Saul was appointed by God. David was appointed by God. And so there's going to be some issues now, some turmoil in Israel because of this difference. There's a lot going on. This is not a terribly long chapter. I debated on how to do this, but since some of those who are in my class have read this, and most of you have not, let's go ahead and read the chapter. It's only 31 verses. It's a really awesome story. I don't know why somebody hadn't made a movie about some of these. These are really cool stories. 2 Samuel chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "Where shall I go up?" He said to him, "To Hebron." So David went up there, his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household, so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there they appointed David king over the house of Judah, and they told David, saying, "The men of Jabesh-Gilead were the ones who buried Saul." So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, "You are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your lord to Saul and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you with kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." But Abner the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul and brought him to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now Abner the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab the son of Zeruiah and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called the Field of Sharp Swords, which is in Gibeon. So there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet on foot as a wild gazelle. So Asahel pursued Abner, and in going he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Are you Asahel?" He answered, "I am." Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and lay hold on one of the young men, and take his armor for yourself." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back, and he fell down there and died on the spot. So it was that as many as came to that place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner, and the sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah, by the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit and took their stand on top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" And Joab said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken surely then, by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and did not pursue Israel any more, nor did they fight any more. Then Abner and his men went on all night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. So Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down, of Benjamin and Abner's men, 360 men who died. Then they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. All right, I want to work through that text. Not quite work through the text, but work through some of what's going on. Back up in chapter 2, verse 1. It happened then that David inquired of the Lord. Now, you guys that are coming into this class today, that's really not that impressive. That's what we think about when we think of David. David was a guy who inquired of the Lord. But if you've been studying Samuel with us, you'll recognize that David has kind of quit listening to the Lord back up there in about chapter 25 when he deals with Abigail and Nabal, which I'll preach on here in a little bit. There's some shaky stuff going on there. In chapter 26, David seems to have lost all faith that God's going to preserve his life, and so he departs and goes to the land of the Philistines. 26, 27, 28, David is doing some things that are sketchy at best, and he's no longer asking the Lord what he should be doing. By the time you get to the end of 1 Samuel, there's a little bit of a revival of his faithfulness to God. He's asking some questions again, and he seems to be listening to God. But by the time we get to chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, David seems to have turned it around. And by the time we get to 2 Samuel 2, David looks more like who he should be. David is now asking the Lord what he should do. He is inquiring of the Lord what God wants him to do. And God tells him, go up specifically to Hebron. Hebron was a famous city in the ancient Israelite culture because of its association with the patriarchs. They loved Hebron, the patriarchs associated with Hebron, and so it's kind of important that David has some association with Hebron. So not only does this connect him to the patriarchal things, it also connects him to God. Now that's going to be really, really important when we start looking at who's really the true king over all of Israel. It ain't Ishbosheth, it's David. And David's going to be recognized by all people. Verse 2, him bringing his wives with him. There's a noticeable woman missing, Michal. She'll be mentioned in a little bit, both in this next chapter and by me in my sermon, because our theme this month is Abigail and Michal. But this section indicates a new chapter in David's life. He's going to become the king he was supposed to be. Verse 4, the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. That's important because of how Ishbosheth will be handled in a few verses. I want you to think through this chapter. There are three men in particular mentioned in verse 18, the sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. You folks that have been in the Samuel class, don't cheat on me here. Does anybody recognize who those three men are? You ought to recognize at least one. Joab, Asahel, and Abishai, or Abishai and Asahel. Joab. So who's Joab? He is David's commander. There's actually a bigger reason. So Joab is the notorietable general of David's army. He was bad to the bone. The other two guys were pretty bad to the bone too. They all three, the sons of Zeruiah, does everybody know who Zeruiah is, or anybody know who Zeruiah is? Yes? So Joab, Abishai, and Asahel are the sons of David's sister. Zeruiah here is David's sister. That's 1 Chronicles 2, 13 through 16. That's part of that genealogical section of 1 Chronicles. So 1 Chronicles 2, 13 through 16. These three men are David's nephews. David's nephews. Which explains something about how extremely devoted they were to David. This goes far beyond just general loyalties or political ties. This is very deep-seated loyalty. Joab being one of the commanders, the chief commander of David's army. Does somebody remember some of the things Joab did? Do what? Anybody remember some of the things Joab did? Absalom. Absalom. His cousin, by the way. He kills Absalom in 2 Samuel 18. Joab, in some books, is even called David's assassin. Because Joab was relentless. If there was a threat to David's throne, Joab had no issues whatsoever killing them. Now you're going to see that in a couple of chapters with Abner. You're going to see that with Absalom later, his own cousin. If there was a threat to David or to David's throne, Joab has no problem whatsoever killing him. In fact, he's really a remarkable fella. He's the only one who speaks to David when David tries to take the census in 2 Samuel 24. Joab is the one who says, David, you ought not be doing that. That was loose Hebrew quotation. But he is a relentlessly loyal follower of David, as the other two are, Abishai and Asahel. Take special notice of the fact that God is not necessarily working directly in any part of this particular chapter, but at the very beginning. He's directing David where David ought to go. He is telling him to take Hebron, to go and dwell there. Verses 4 through 7, all of this is directed towards God and what God would have for Israel. I made this point a minute ago. Verse 4, the men of Judah came. They anointed David king over the house of Judah. They told David, saying, here's what happened, men of Jabesh Gilead and all these things. But then jump down to verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, over Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Do you notice the difference? David was appointed because the people wanted him. Ishbosheth was appointed because Abner appointed him. The real power struggle here is not David and Ishbosheth. It's David and Abner. Abner was a cousin of Saul. I said at one class several classes back that he was Saul's nephew. I was wrong. I meant to say cousin. But he had familial ties to Saul. He was the man who had all the gusto in Israel. He was the commander of Saul's army. He's the one who had more influence than anybody, which is why he takes Ishbosheth and appoints him as king over Israel. There's a lot of a power struggle here all through these chapters while we're trying to figure out who really is the king. But David has not only Judah behind him, David has God behind him. He's working alongside with what God would have him do and what God would have him be. And that is important to note because that was one thing Saul did not do. Saul did not inquire of the Lord. Saul did not go where God directed him to do, or go where God directed him to go, did not do what God directed him to do. David is noticeably different, and it will make all the difference in how long he reigns as king and how prosperous his kingdom really is. Now, you're thinking through some of these things, and I want to unpack the story in just a second between Abner and Asahel. David does remarkable good here after he has made some terrible choices. All of this section reminds us of his overall faithfulness before God and his faithfulness to God's way of doing things. Verse 4, he receives the news about Jabesh Gilead. Verse 5, David sends messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead. And notice what he says. You're blessed of the Lord. You have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I will also repay you this kindness because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. Very wise political move here. Jabesh Gilead was a prominent northern city. And what David does is writes them a letter and says, guys, I appreciate what you did for Saul. You think that would endear him to those who were loyal to Saul? That's where you do this. Yeah. Not only was David respectful of Saul, not only did David love Saul, but David admired those who respected Saul. And so he sends them the letter, you've done this, good for you. Now take courage, be strong. You're going to need it. There's a reason they were going to need it too. Let me give you a little bit of a snapshot here. That's the Gibeon pool. I'll come back to that. Okay. So here is, David is down here at Hebron. You can see the little star. This is Jabesh Gilead. Up here, why am I doing it that way? Let me do it this way. Here is Jabesh Gilead, just on the east side of the Jordan River, which means they were more vulnerable to the Ammonites on this side and the Philistines who had come up into this part of the country and had claimed part of this for themselves. So this Jabesh Gilead, a prominent northern city, was in a dangerous situation. Not only were they against this particular threat on all this side here, but they had lost their great shield and defender, Saul. And with all of Saul's flaws, Saul was a pretty good military man. Now, he lost some battles, but Saul was a pretty good military man. Chapter 1, David honors him by saying such things. The mighty men of valor have died. Saul was that guy, and Jonathan was that guy. So David sends this letter from Hebron to Jabesh Gilead to secure their loyalties, not only to encourage them and strengthen them, but to also garner their own loyalties. The men of Judah have appointed me over Judah. I am now king. So get in line. So you can see David kind of playing this political thing here a little bit. In this particular chapter, there's some things that's mentioned that we aren't really told about in Samuel. Verse 3, David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household, so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. In 1 Samuel, we're told there's about 600 men and their families. But when you go and read 1 Chronicles 12, you actually get a little better picture. There were a lot of people who were defecting from Saul's army and coming over to David's army. So David's army during these years where Saul is kind of, and by the way, that he's going down, right? Okay. So while Saul is going down, he's losing the faithfulness of his own military. They don't trust him or count on him anymore. So those folks are defecting to Saul or to David. And so David's army at the end of 1 Samuel is swelling. And by the time we get to this particular chapter, it's a pretty good sized army with all the families, with all the children, with all the possessions. David's got some push behind him. That's kind of important too. It's going to explain why they mopped the floor with Abner's guys in just a minute. It's also going to explain why chapter 3 verse 1, David prevailed over Ishbosheth. Okay? Look at Asahel again in verse 18. I know this, to some of you, you're like, we're all over the place. Well, I'm generally following what we do in class back there while we're talking through the passage, okay? So Asahel is listed as the third one of verse 18. That's not only here, it's actually, and when he's recorded in 1 Chronicles 2, suggests that he's the youngest of these three men. Now, there are some guys who think, well, maybe he was really inexperienced in war, and that's why this whole situation happens with Abner. I don't know if that's the case. Look over at 2 Samuel 23. 2 Samuel 23, you may remember this chapter. 2 Samuel 23 is the list of David's mighty men. And you talk about just one of the coolest chapters in the whole Bible. David's mighty men. Beginning in verse 8, he lists some of these fellows. And I'm going to tell you what, you just read some of the accomplishments of these folks. Verse 8, he was called Adino the Eznite because he had killed 800 men at one time. Woo! You look at verse 9. Eleazar the son of Dodo the Ahohite, one of the three mighty men when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there for battle. He alone stood with David. Verse 10, he arose and attacked the Philistines until his hand was weary and his hand was stuck to the sword. And the Lord brought a great victory that day. Down in verse 13, lists these three chief men over the 30 and the great accomplishments that they had. Verse 16, the three mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but he poured it out to the Lord. I mean, these guys are storming strongholds, bringing back buckets of water for the king, just to honor him. Down in verse 18, Abishai, the brother of Joab, is mentioned. He lifted his spear against 300 men and killed them. Verse 20, Benaiah, he was a valiant and mighty man. He killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab. He went down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day, which is just, I mean, that doesn't even get cooler, man. This is the group of fellas that are listed through this section. Verse 21, he killed an Egyptian, a spectacular man. Verse 22, he was a mighty man. But guys, verse 24, Asahel, the brother of Joab, was one of the 30. Now, obviously, he wasn't one of the preeminent men among the 30, but you can hardly look at this passage and just think Asahel was just some young, dumb kid who didn't know nothing, who was inexperienced in war, and Abner took advantage of the situation. I don't think that that's fair. I think what this text is actually doing, believe it or not, is representing Abner as being not only a fairly good man, but as a man who was bad to the bone in his own right. He was a mighty man of war in his own way, and Asahel seems to have fell. I didn't mean to rhyme. Asahel fell at the hands of Abner, probably because of impetuosity. So, Asahel falls. Joab, the great man who was so loyal to David. Look at verse 22. While they're having this interaction in verse 22, Abner turns to Asahel and says, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" Now, there's a couple of ways to take that. Maybe Joab and Abner were friends at one time. I don't necessarily think that that's it. I think it's probably because of what happens at the end of this chapter. I think it's probably what ends up happening in the next chapter when Joab murders Abner. I think that it suggests Joab was every bit as bad as we generally think he was. Joab doesn't have those lists of accomplishments that we just read about in 2 Samuel 23. We don't have a record of him going into a snowy pit and killing a lion. We don't have him depicted as killing 800 Philistines in one day. But guys, there was a reason Joab was the commander of the entire army of David. This guy was pretty intimidating. And Abner, in verse 22, I think suggests that here. I'll kill you, Asahel, but I don't want to face your brother when I do it. Seems to be what's going on in this particular passage. All of the violence and bloodshed that David didn't want, Joab was absolutely unfazed by causing. We're going to see that in the next chapter. Y'all won't, but my class will. We'll see it in the next chapter. All right, I want to think a little bit about Abner. I said earlier that he's a fellow who was Saul's cousin in 1 Samuel 14. Ishbosheth is a nobody. But Abner takes him because he is the last son of Saul, or the next son of Saul, that could reign. But you notice in verse 8, he takes him over to Mahanaim. That is to, in some ways, subtly remind us this was not the appropriate way of doing things. Why do we have the whole kingdom of Israel here, and yet, here's Gibeon, this is generally the area where Saul dies. Here's Jebus, or Jerusalem, right in this particular area. Why is Ishbosheth not appointed as king over all of Israel? Why do they take this little flight out to Mahanaim here and appoint him as king over there? Because this was not legitimate. Now, he may have had a lineage claim to the throne, but he was not going to be the king. He was not going to be recognized, and for the most part, the folks knew it. Abner is the real power behind the northern nation. And it's kind of important to think, folks, this is the first transition of kings. Does everybody get that? Saul is the appointed king over all of Israel, right? Saul's king. This is the first transition of power from one king to the next. And you notice what happens? There's a division. You guys see that? How did it divide? This is a softball question. How did it divide? Appointed, not appointed? Geographically. Now it should be a softball question. Yeah. How did it divide? The northern and the southern. Well, that seems familiar in our own history, doesn't it? So you think about it, guys. How is it going to divide later under Jeroboam and Rehoboam? Same way. The same way. You're going to have this schism that never truly goes away, which is part of what makes David's reign and Solomon's reign really so incredible, guys. Because that's that one period where the united nation is actually united. They're loyal to David later. They're really loyal to Solomon. But it is no wonder that when they divide, after Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam divide the nations, it's no wonder they divide the same way they divided here. And I don't know what colors those are. Is that purple and red? Blue and green? Whatever. Those two colors, the south one is David's reign. Okay? I told you all 100 times I'm colorblind. David's reign is the southern one. Okay? Ishbosheth takes command of that whole other color. Green, red, purple, pink, I don't know. David takes control, or Ishbosheth takes control of that area. Okay? And David takes control of the other. But all of that's going to be really important, folks, because when David finally assumes control over all of it, when he is finally king and recognized as such, he's going to actually take nearly the entire region. Okay? This may be helpful here. Look at all the threats all the way around them. Edom and Moab and Ammon. This is Ishbosheth's, and this is Israel, David. This is the Philistines. See what I was talking about earlier about them being a little to the north here in that whatever color. And Aram and the Phoenicia. I mean, guys, they're surrounded by enemies. But all of this inner turmoil on the inside is what's causing some of the problems. Here's a different picture. Green is the future reign of David. Now you can see the two colors on the inside, similar shapes we were just looking at. David will eventually, when he takes the throne and he expands the empire and he has loyalty all across, he's going to spread it as far as the green highlighted area. This is a big deal. It's a big deal. This paves the way for Solomon's reign later, and Solomon won't really expand the empire, not at least by military force. He will expand the empire by trade and commerce and treaties. Political giant. David was a man of war. That's why he couldn't build the temple, folks. But you've got all this going on. I want you to see this. This pool that they gather around is right here in Gibeon. And you can kind of see here, this is a map of the terrain. David comes up from Hebron to Gibeon, and then Mahanaim, they come over. Ishbosheth comes across the ford of the Jordan, and then up across the mountains of Gibeon. And this is the actual pool that is still there today. They found this pool. That's what I'm saying. This is the pool that we're reading about in 2 Samuel 2. And you can see the folks standing there. Those are not children, those are grown people. And that is a monstrous pool. That is a reservoir for natural water. And you can see the steps go down into it. I put some descriptions there. It's 37 feet in diameter. It's 35 feet deep with a 5-foot spiral staircase around the inside of the pool. And so you can imagine these two men, these two giants, Abner on one side, Joab on the other, gather these opposing armies at this pool. And the chiefs of this military sat on opposite sides of this pool and just look at each other. And after they're sitting there for a little while, Abner suggests, verse 14, that what they do is have the young men come up and compete before them. Not uncommon in the ancient world. If you'll recall, that's a little bit of what David and Goliath do. So you have these two opposing armies. The Philistines say, here, we'll put our champion out, and Israel's supposed to put their champion out, And those champions decide the fate of the war, right? So similar thing going on here, although it may not be so decisive, as you'll see in the next few verses. These two militaries sit around this pool. They put these men out to spar, and you'll notice it's 12 from each side. Maybe there's a little bit of irony there. 12 tribes, 12 representatives here. They fight. What happens? They all kill each other. Nothing's decided. So what happens then? Well, it looks like a big old battle breaks out. And then as Abner runs, Asahel catches him. Okay? Now, if, we're not really told the specifics of this, but if they're fighting actually down in the pool, which wasn't uncommon, especially if they are trying to all watch them fight, imagine the 5-foot steps there, 5-foot wide steps there covered in water and slippery and it's stone, and then you got 24 guys fighting down in there. Yep, people die doing that. So you've got Abner who takes off, and Asahel who chases him, and you got to love the little detail in verse 18 that he's as fast as a wild gazelle. That means fast, guys. I mean, I'm pretty sure I could still beat him in a foot race. What'd you laugh for? That wasn't... I was just checking. But Asahel's going to catch him. Abner can't outrun him. And the image is actually of Abner and Asahel talking while they're running. And so Abner says, "Who are you?" Asahel says, "I'm Asahel." And then he goes, "Let's call this off." What Abner does is offers Asahel somebody else. It's kind of an insult. Abner goes, essentially, "You can't handle me, boy. You need to turn back." Asahel says, "I'm not turning back." And Abner says, "If you want blood, turn and take one of these young soldiers beside me." Now, I don't think it's a coward move. I think he's trying to allay the bloodshed. We're going to see that in a few passages. But he says, "No, you take this young man, you can claim him, kill him, and you can take his stuff." That was a big trophy from war. Asahel says, "No. If he can take him, he ends all the conflict. If he takes him, Ishbosheth doesn't have any military anymore." So Asahel's got one thing on his mind, and that's killing Abner. And Abner, of course, like you have probably done when you were a kid, is running and all of a sudden just drops the hilt of his spear in the ground. And Asahel, running so fast behind him, impales himself on it. Okay, goes right up through his abdomen and out his back. That's how, number one, that tells you how sharp the spear was, but it also tells you how fast Asahel was. This is a pretty incredible story. Asahel dies, and Joab will not forgive Abner for this. Said it a moment ago, he's going to kill Abner in the next chapter because of this. Just a couple other points, and I'm going to give you some applications. Abner seems to spend a few years trying to help Ishbosheth claim the throne. By the time Ishbosheth takes the throne, he's 40 years old. Now he's reigning over all Israel, and he only reigns 2 years. That would appear to be the last 2 years of David's 7 while David is in Hebron. Because when Ishbosheth goes down, David assumes the entire throne, and he's over all of Israel now. Okay? So that 2 years is after David has been reigning for 5 years in Hebron. So there's a lot going on there that may be worth pointing out. Abner and Joab's interaction at the pool is just weird. It's going to get weirder at the end of the chapter when Abner says, "Let's just kind of stop fighting," and Joab's got him on the run. And Joab goes, "Yeah, let's quit fighting." What? Why stop now? You got him on the run. Well, seems to be because of all the bloodshed that has already happened. You got to remember, guys, this is a civil war. This is not fighting the Ammonites, the Philistines. This is not fighting the godless pagans. This is fighting those who descend from Israel. It's a civil war. That's terrible. And so Joab listens to the advice of Abner, calls it off, but he's going to get him back in the next chapter. There's a lot going on there. Abner does not fear Asahel, but he sure is afraid of Joab. He doesn't say to Joab, "I can kill you." Did you catch that? We read that passage. He tells Asahel, "You keep coming after me, I'm going to kill you, boy." But when Joab's chasing him, he doesn't go, "Keep coming after me, Joab, I'm going to kill you too." Nope. Joab's pretty bad to the bone. All right. You can see why Joab is the commander of all of David's army. He is the man who is calm and collect in the moment. He's going to bait this moment, and he's going to wait for his appropriate time to do what he wants to do. There's a reason David has him selected as the absolute commander of all that he has. And then this again explains some of the turmoil we're going to see in 1st and 2nd Kings. When Solomon, the next king, takes the throne, 1st and 2nd Kings looks like some kind of a mob movie. David is saying, Solomon, you're fixing to be king. You need to go kill this guy, you need to go kill this guy, and you need to go kill this guy. And Solomon takes the throne and goes, you're dead, and you're dead, and you're dead. It is really cool if you're a 12-year-old boy or a 32-year-old man. You ready for some applications? All right. You guys have been good sports for this class. It's weird. I have not been teaching it like this. We've been doing more of a discussion class, and that makes it a little tough. Discussion classes, in my opinion, don't work very good in the auditorium, and so I don't do them. But anyways, here you go. Some applications from this chapter. Number one, we need to be careful making assumptions without inquiring God's will. You actually see this pop up all through the end of 1 Samuel. You're already seeing it in 2 Samuel. David makes some assumptions about God's will. It gets him into some trouble. Saul makes big assumptions about God's will, and it leads to his life ending. We get into this particular book, David doesn't make any assumptions anymore. David's going, Lord, what do you want me to do? Guys, we need to have that attitude, that disposition. Lord, what do you want from me? And I'm willing to do it. So we need to seek out the Lord's will, make sure what we're doing is consistent with what He wants us to do. Number two, sometimes the right thing can be attempted at the wrong time or in the wrong way. I think it's important to say or in the wrong way because here's the truth of the matter. Abner is leading a rebellion against the Lord's anointed king, David. Abner needs to die. But Asahel, trying to do it by himself, probably wasn't the best way to do that. What if he had waited and sought a more opportune time? What if he had waited and let Joab join him in the pursuit? Might have turned out totally different for him. Guys, there are a lot of things that we're supposed to be doing, and there's a right way to do them. Sometimes there's not only a right way and a right thing, sometimes there's a right time to do them. And we need to make sure we understand that. Think about somebody in sin, and we need to go to them as a brother in Christ. Right way, a right time, and a right thing. Think about the work of the local church. There's a right way, and a right time, and a right thing. Think about some things the church shouldn't be doing. Okay? There's a right thing, a right way, and a right time. And we need to make sure we're really careful about what we're doing as people, as individuals, and as members of this congregation to reflect that in all that we do. And then number three, self-serving mentality kills. It's fascinating that you're actually seeing this happen in an Old Testament illustration. But guys, we see this exemplified in the New Testament. What's some of the things we're supposed to do as Christians following King Jesus? We're supposed to submit to each other. We're supposed to look out for the needs of others. Guys, that's supposed to be us. And it's incredible we can look at an Old Testament illustration and see somebody who didn't do that in the moment. Now, I'm not trying to criticize Asahel necessarily, and I'm not saying that this was indeed his motive in the passage. Don't know. Doesn't make a difference right now. But if he had just waited a minute, everything would have turned out differently for him. By the way, Abner appointing Ishbosheth as king, guys, Ishbosheth's going to die. Abner's going to die. That's all coming up in a few chapters. What would have happened differently had they, instead of seeking themselves, sought the better of all of Israel? Okay? You see David calling for that in 2 Samuel 1 when he is praying and crying over Saul's demise. This was not good for Israel. David comes out and just says it. This wasn't good for Israel. He's heartbroken over the whole thing. But what if Ishbosheth and Abner had had the same approach? All right, I appreciate y'all's attention this morning. Y'all were good sports with it. What did you think of that? Was it Hebrews? Did it fit with Hebrews as well? No, probably not. Russ will still be gone Wednesday. I think Larry is filling in for him Wednesday night. And then my class will be back in the back again on Wednesday. I appreciate y'all's attention this morning.